Καλησπέρα. Αγαπητά μέλη, αγαπητές φίλες, αγαπητοί φίλοι του Αιγαία. Καλώς ήρθατε στη σημερινή βραδιά. Δεν θα πω και πολλά, μια μικρή εισαγωγή και μετά θα ακολουθήσει κατευθείαν η διάλεξη του κ. Μπένετ και μετά θα έχουμε την ωραία μας την δεξίωση κάτω στον κήπο. Η σημερινή μέρα κλείνει μέσα της ιδιαίτερη χαρά για μας, για όλους όσους διοργανώνουμε ιδίως την ετήσια αυτή συνάντηση. Αποτελεί έμπρακτη απόδειξη πως κατορθώσαμε να κρατήσουμε την εταιρεία αυτή ζωντανή, καθώς η χρονιά που πέρασε ήταν η πιο δύσκολη που έχει βιώσει ο ΓΕΦ στα λίγα χρόνια ύπαρξής του. Ειλικρινά βρεθήκαμε ένα βήμα πριν την πάυση των δραστηριοτήτων μας. Η οικονομική καταστροφή του καλοκαιριού και η συνθήκη επιβολής capital controls είχαν ως αποτέλεσμα περιορισμένες ανανεώσεις συνδρομών και ως εκ τούτου τη δραματική μείωση των εσόδων της εταιρείας. Και όχι μόνο αυτό. Το Νοέμβριο η εταιρεία κλήθηκε να καταβάλει τέλος επιδιδέματος, όχι μόνο για τη χρονιά που μας πέρασε, αλλά και αναδρομικά για το 2013. Συνολικά 1.000 ευρώ φόρο, ποσό που αντιστοιχεί περίπου στις 40 συνδρομές. Στο πλαίσιο αυτό, η πρόσκληση που απευθύναμε τον περασμένο Νοέμβριο εισακούστη από όλα σχεδόν τα μέλη μας και η στήριξή τους απομάκρυνε το ενδεχόμενο του οικονομικού στραγγαλισμού. Για μας είναι μεγάλη τιμή η σταθερή εμπιστοσύνη που επιδεικνύουν τα μέλη μας στο πρόσωπο του Αιγαία. Πέρα όμως από τις οικονομικές δυσκολίες που αντιμετωπίσαμε φέτος, ένα άλλο σημαντικότατο πρόβλημα που έχει εγκύψει ιδίως τα τελευταία χρόνια και ιδίως τα τελευταία χρόνια ταλανίζει όχι μόνο τη χώρα μας, αλλά και τον ίδιο τον Αιγαία. Αναφέρομαι στη μετανάστευση των επιστημόνων μας, γνωστή με τον αγγλικό όρο brain drain. Το παράδειγμα του Αιγαία θα μπορούσε να αποτελέσει χαρακτηριστική περίπτωση. Η κεντρική ομάδα του Αιγαία αποτελείται από 11 αρχαιολόγους, όλοι τους με εξαιρετικές σπουδές. Δυστυχώς, καθώς είναι αδύνατον πλέον να βρει κάποιος εργασία εδώ στο πεδίο της αρχαιολογίας, οι περισσότεροι εκ του βασικού αυτού πυρήνα έχουν καταφύγει στο εξωτερικό. Έτσι, η Ιωάννα Γαλανάκη, η οποία φέτος ήταν στην Κρήτη, αναχωρεί το ερχόμενο Σεπτέμβριο μόνιμα για την Αγγλία. Ο Λευτέρης Ζόρζος ζει στην Σαντορίνη και ασχολείται πλέον με τις οικογενειακές του επιχειρήσεις. Η Τατιάνα Θεοδωροπούλου έχει εγκατασταθεί στο Παρίσι. Η Ελίνα Καρδαμάκη στην Αυστρία. Η Έλενα Μαραγκουδάκη εργαζόταν τα 2 τελευταία έτη στην Κρήτη και ήρθε πρόσφατα πριν μερικούς μήνες στην Αθήνα. Η Εύη Μαργαρίτη είναι μόνιμα στην Κύπρο. Η Καλλιόπη Σαρή στη Δανία και η Αναστασία Χριστοφιλοπούλου στο Cambridge. Φέτος στην Αθήνα βρίσκονταν μόνο ο Κώστας Πασχαλίδης, ο οποίος και αυτός την περίοδο αυτή βρίσκεται στο εξωτερικό, η Ιωάννα Μουτάφη και ο υποφαινόμενος. Μολονότι επικοινωνούμε συχνά μέσω ηλεκτρονικού ταχυδρομείου, ωστόσο είναι κατανοητό ότι η φυσική παρουσία στην έδρα της εταιρείας είναι απαραίτητη για να μπορέσει ο ΓΕΦ να παράξει έργο. Και ένας από τους πρωτεύοντες σκοπούς μας, αμέσως μετά το πέρας των ανασκαφών του καλοκαιριού, θα είναι και η ένταξη και άλλων μελών στο βασικό κορμό του Αιγαία. Για όλους τους παραπάνω λόγους, το έργο του Αιγαία φέτος εστίασε σε λίγες αλλά κέρυες δραστηριότητες. Το ενημερωτικό μας δελτίο, βασικό μας μέλημα υπήρξε η μηνιαία αποστολή του ενημερωτικού μας δελτίου με πλήθος πληροφοριών για νέα βιβλία, νέα άρθρα, νέες βιβλιοκρισίες, διαλέξεις, καθώς και πολλές άλλες ενδιαφέρουσες πληροφορίες. Στη διαφάνεια μπορείτε να δείτε κάποια από τα εξώφυλλα των ενημερωτικών δελτίων που στάλθηκαν κατά την τελευταία ακαδημαϊκή χρονιά. Να ευχαριστήσουμε στο σημείο αυτό τη γραφίστρια Δανάη Βλάχου, που επιμελείται κομίζοντας υψηλή αισθητική τα εξώφυλλα των δελτίων μας. Σε συνεργασία με το Σουηδικό Ινστιτούτο Αθηνών, συνεχίσαμε επίσης τη σειρά των αιγαιακών διαλέξεων. Βαθύτατες ευχαριστίες θα πρέπει να απευθύνουμε στον Διευθυντή του Σουηδικού Ινστιτούτου, Dr. Arto Pentinen, για την εξαιρετική συνεργασία που είχαμε για άλλη μία χρονιά. Και καθώς αφού λέει ο λαός πως αν δεν μπενέψουμε το σπίτι μας θα πέσει να μας πλακώσει, θα πρέπει να σημειώσουμε εδώ πως ο φετινός κύκλος των διαλέξεων εγκομιάστηκε θερμά από πολλούς για την επιλογή των ομιλητών μας. Όλες οι ομιλίες ήταν πράγματι άρτια οργανωμένες και έχουν δε βιντεοσκοπηθεί. Με την ελπίδα βέβαια πως θα συγκεντρώσουμε πόρους, προσδοκούμε να τις αναρτήσουμε σε κάποια φάση στον ιστότοπο του Αιγαία. Οι υπεύθυνοι των αιγαιακών βιβλιοκρισιών Είναι η Τατιάνα Θεοδωροπούλου, η Αναστασία Χριστοφολουπούλου και ο Κόλιν Μακδόναλντ. Κατά τη φετινή ακαδημαϊκή χρονιά παρουσιάστηκαν η βιβλιοκρισία της Βάσους Φώτου για το βιβλίο της Maud Voltaire, Construire un crête minoenne, η οποία λόγω του μεγάλου μεγέθους της δημοσιεύθηκε ως άρθρο βιβλιοκρισία στο περιοδικό του Αιγαία, καθώς και η βιβλιοκρισία της Μαρίας Αναστασιάδου για το βιβλίο Mignon Carson Seals. Η οικονομική κατάρρευση της χώρας, που συντελείται τα τελευταία χρόνια με αποκορύφωμα τη φετινή χρονιά, έχει ως αποτέλεσμα πολλά προβλήματα ανθρωπιστικής φύσεως. Μέσα σε μια εποχή όπου πολλοί συνάνθρωποι μας ζουν στα όρια της φτώχειας, έχουν χάσει την εργασία και το σπίτι τους, διαρωτάται κανείς κατά πόσο άραγε χρήσιμη είναι μια επιστημονική εταιρεία όπως είναι ο ΕΓΕΒΣ. Από το καλοκαίρι και μετά όλοι παρακολουθούμε άναυδοι χιλιάδες πρόσφυγες που προσπαθώντας να βρουν ένα καλύτερο μέλλον στην Ευρώπη, χάνουν συχνά τη ζωή τους στα νερά του Αιγαίου. Είναι μια τέτοια φωτογραφία που πιστεύω ότι θα συγκλώνησε πολλούς από εμάς στην αίθουσα αυτή. Ένας πρόσφυγας Σύριος να κουβαλάει στις πλάτες του τον πατέρα του. Είναι δε και αυτή η φωτογραφία που έδωσε και την απάντηση στο παραπάνω ερώτημα. Αν οι πολιτικοί μας γνώριζαν λίγη ιστορία, τότε αναμφισβήτητα δεν θα είχαμε πάρει αυτή την πορεία σήμερα. Η ιστορία δεν έχει ευθύγραμμη πορεία. Αποτελείται δε από πολλούς επαναλαμβανόμενους κύκλους με διαφορετικούς πάντα πρωταγωνιστές. Έτσι, όσοι γνωρίζουν την ιστορία και τον πολιτισμό μας, πολύ εύκολα θα μπορούσαν να δουν στο πρόσωπο του πρόσφυγα τον Ενία να κουβαλάει τον πατέρα του Αγχύση έξω από την φλεγόμενη Τρία. Είναι μέσα σε αυτό το πλαίσιο που πιστεύουμε ότι είναι καθήκον μας να διαφυλάξουμε το ιστορικό και πολιτισμικό μας παρελθόν, έστω και με τα λίγα πενιχρά μέσα που διαθέτει αυτή η εταιρεία. Αυτός είναι ο σκοπός μας, αυτό είναι το μέλλον του Αιγαία. Πώς εδώ μάλλον, σε μια εποχή που ο πολιτισμός μας βάλεται πανταχώθεν. Εδώ και χρόνια η Βρετανική Σχολή μας βοηθά στο έργο μας παραχωρώντας το Upper House και τον κήπο της σχολής για την ετήσια συνάντηση του Αιγαία. Σήμερα έχουμε την τιμή να έχουμε ομιλητή ένα μέλος του Αιγαία, τον καθηγητή John Bennett, και συνάμα διευθυντή της Βρετανικής Σχολής Αθηνών. Ο John Bennett γεννήθηκε στη Σιγκαπούρη και μεγάλωσε στην Αγγλία, στο Yorkshire. Σπούδασε στο Cambridge, όπου ολοκλήρωσε τη διδακτορική του διατριβή στη διοικητική οργάνωση της Τερομηνιακής 2-3Β Κρήτης. Από το 1986 έως το 1998 δίδαξε στο Τμήμα Κλασικών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου του Wisconsin-Madison στην Αμερική, κατόπιν στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Οξφόρδης και από το 2004 είναι καθηγητής αρχαιολογίας στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Sheffield. Από την 1η Οκτωβρίου του περασμένου έτους έχει έρθει στην Ελλάδα ως διευθυντής της Βρετανικής Σχολής στην Αθήνα. Έχει συγγράψει πλήθος άρθρων και θεωρείται ένας από τους πλέον εξειδικευμένους αρχαιολόγους σε θέματα της γραμμικής β' γραφής. Η σημερινή διάλεξη έχει τίτλο «Σε τι χρησιμεύαν τα αιγαιακά κείμενα». Αγαπητέ Τζον, σε ευχαριστούμε πολύ για τη φιλοξενία και σε καλωσορίζουμε το ίδιο φιλόξενα σε αιγαιακές διαλέξεις.
Should be down the bottom. Καλησπέρα. Ευχαριστώ, Νεκτάρια, και όλους για την παρουσία σας. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά. Είναι πιο εύκολο για μένα. Good evening, everyone. A simple question, what were Aegean texts for? But I hope you'll agree by the end of the talk that it's a rather complex and difficult one to answer. And in fact, I don't pretend to be able to answer it and I promise you I'll make it no longer than 40 minutes in the period. But what I hope to get to the point at the end where we at least realise what the issues are and how we might go about thinking about what Aegean texts were for. So I want to start just very briefly by really sketching a sort of momentum that arose with before the decipherment even, when Evans discovered, first of all, scripts and then specifically Linear B, and then to think a little bit about the properties of those objects that bear text and how they have facilitated a certain type of writing of history, if you like, but then to look at the severe limitations of those texts for writing that kind of history. And then to try to move towards the end to what one might consider an emic view, if you like, a view of how texts might have functioned within the society to which they belong. And then at the end, I hope to convince you why this might actually have mattered. The 19th century was, one might argue, was a century of decipherments, with all of the decipherments that you see there on the slide, Egyptian, Old Persian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Cypriot syllabary, happening all through bilinguals. And that's setting up a bit of a momentum, as I said, for Arthur Evans, who in 1894 first published examples of what he had to argue at the time were examples of writing, like the object you see on the far right of the screen. He called this writing pictographic originally. He thought it moved towards a more linear form. He thought it was associated with the Etio-Cretan, i.e. the non-Greek speaking, prehistoric inhabitants of the island of Crete. And he even saw in these scripts the origins of both Cypriot and Phoenician scripts. At almost the same time, Christos Tsundas had excavated at Mycenae and other places, and in 1893, 2 years after this particular publication, he argued that he wrote about the Mykenaikos politismos, the Mycenaean, Mykenaios politismos, the Mycenaean civilization. Tsundas had argued, of course, that it was Greek, as you see there in the quotation, but that it was illiterate. So we ended up at the very beginning, if you like, of the 20th century with two points of view. First of all, the inhabitants of Bronze Age Greece were illiterate but Greek, and then ironically that they were literate but not Greek in the case of Evans's view. Now, despite almost 50 years of Evans attempting to decipher the script, and many sort of fanciful ideas about the contents of the Linear B script, Evans's contribution to scholarship made it absolutely clear the nature of these documents. They were inventories of people. They used ideograms to denote commodities and people. They used a decimal number system. The script was almost certainly a simple syllabary. And he also referred to some patterns in words on tablets. What, of course, he could not accept, and did not accept ever, was that the language behind Linear B could be Greek. The presence of documents set up expectations throughout the period before the decipherment that what we would ultimately find, or what these documents might explain, was essentially the bridge between the Minoan civilization and the Mycenaean civilization, which was largely known through the texts of Homer. So Lang, in 1906, expected that these documents had preserved the epic from the Minoan period into the Mycenaean. Evans himself entered into the debate, arguing that the materials of an earlier Minoan epic had been taken over into Greek. And John Myers, who you see at the top there, imagined a Minoan archetype for the Homeric poems, which had been compiled together rather like the Old Testament. Even after the decipherment, in Wace's foreword to Documents in Mycenaean Greek, the first full publication of a large amount of translated material from the Mycenaean documents, he sort of longed for some long-forgotten forerunner of Homer to turn up using the Linear B script. And of course, he was very emphatic about the fact that the demonstration that the language behind the script was Greek had confirmed that bridge, that link from the late Bronze Age through to the later historical periods, the one that Tsundas had argued, but had argued not on the basis of language because of the fact that he thought the period was illiterate. The decipherment, of course, initiated a new field of study, which Chadwick and Ventris, again in Documents, the first publication, argued constituted a new research discipline. And indeed that's true, because there were no people who were trained in the Mycenaean documents at that time. There were philologists, there were linguists, there were historians, there were literary scholars and so on, but there was no one who, by definition, could be trained in this. So it was a new field which was established. There was a temptation to use the existing text, the texts of Homer, to try to understand both the language in detail, but also the setup, the overall picture that emerged from the documents. And that was rapidly quashed by others, but particularly by Moses Finley, who had argued that the Homeric texts really had no relevance. They were not only not a reliable guide, as he said in the middle quote, but no guide at all to the late Bronze Age. And he argued that to understand the nature of these documents, you had to work by analogy, and you had to go to what he saw as the comparable texts in broadly the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. And that has been something that's been quite prevalent in the field since that time, although it's becoming to be eroded, or at least more complicated in the way we look at things in relation to Linear B nowadays. Now, with a new field, the first thing you have to do, of course, is to enrich and maximize your database. So there was a great deal of work done on obviously understanding individual documents, on establishing the text, joining documents, establishing readings and so on, and broadly building the corpora from Knossos, from Pylos, and other places as those came on stream. But there was also a temptation to take bits from the surviving archives, the surviving assemblages of documents, and to put them all together in order to create a sort of hybrid or a meta-archive that drew on different documents from different times and places to create a sort of maximal understanding of the way that Mycenaean bureaucracy worked. And of course that belies the fact that there are both contrasts and similarities between the documents and the operations at different sites. And it's up to us to be very clear whether we think those are real differences that depend on historical contingencies, essentially the time in which the documents were written, or whether they're based on recovery. We simply haven't found documents in those areas at those sites, or if it's taphonomically derived, that they weren't preserved for one reason or another. So there are problems in this idea of bringing them together, but as the field in its initial phases, one can understand why that attempt to create this sort of meta-archive was carried out. Now I want to think a little bit about the properties of Linear B text, and I want to start with a very simple point, which I think does bear repeating, and that is that any text that survives from the ancient world is by definition a physical object. It can only survive because it's been preserved archaeologically for 10 years, for 1,000 years, for 3-4 millennia into the present. But a document bearing text has two very important properties. In blue on the left, it is a text, and the text on that document may refer to places and times that are near or distant to the actual physical point of that text. So it may refer to something that's going on at the same time. It may, as in the text of Homer, for example, refer to a period earlier than Homer, or indeed it may, because texts are like that, refer to something that is entirely fictitious, that doesn't exist, or that hasn't existed yet because it may refer to the future. But that content is to some extent distinct from, although it's bound up with, it can't be physically separated from the object on which it sits. And that object has a context. It occupies a space, it fits into a time, and it has associations with other objects, both texts and all sorts of other objects that belong in that same context. So an ancient document has both of those properties. And I'd like to argue that it's the first property, the content, which has allowed us to lift the text, if you like, and to create our own narratives based on the text, which is divorced in some senses from its particular context. And I just pick, and I didn't do this entirely at random, but I'm not picking on Emily Vermeulen because I think she's a bad or egregiously bad example of this, but simply because she's thinking about this issue, and she argues in a chapter called Mycenaean History, in relation to Mycenaean history, that there are three principal sources: the Linear B documents, foreign records and foreign exchanges of goods, so archaeology in that particular instance, and Greek tradition. So she saw that reconstructing the Aegean Bronze Age was about drawing together all those different strands to create what she thought of as a history. And she constructed that history in the way that we might think of in the left there, in the chapter titles of her book, proceeding from earliest times through to latest times in the sort of post-Mycenaean period in chapter 9. Chadwick, Emily Vermeule's first edition was earlier than Chadwick's, but her second edition was quite close to Chadwick's Mycenaean World, was drawn largely on the Linear B text, by, as one would expect, since that was his expertise. And what we're really looking at there is almost a synchronic history, if you like, and that's why his chapter titles start off with the Hellenization of Greece, about the linguistic history, really, of Greece, but then move quite quickly into thematic chapters which deal essentially with the period of the Linear B documents. There's not a time depth in the way that there is in Emily Vermeule's text. And the way that I like to think about this sort of this type of approach, if this one way of thinking about what the texts are for, that the texts are there, embedded in the content on documents, to extract information for us to use in the modern scholarly context. So that's the first model, if you like. And I'm going to call that an etic view. It's a view that we organize and put together and structure rather than it belonging to categories that people at the time would necessarily have recognized. Now, it's the other side of that property of documents, the context, of course, shed some very important light on the way these documents were used. At a very basic level, they don't all occur in the same type of textual context. So at Pylos, newly opening a week on Sunday, 12th of June, the site. In rooms 23 and 24, which were behind the main megaron at Pylos, there was storage of perfumed olive oil in jars, and we have a small number of texts which relate to the disbursements of oil. So not surprising, you have them in association with a commodity that's stored there and presumably being dispersed there. By contrast, rooms 7 and 8, as you enter the main palatial building, had about 80%, so probably close to 1,000, 800 or so documents in those two rooms. And clearly they don't all relate to activities that are going on in those two rooms. They relate to activities spread across the entire kingdom, to activities that will take place, to activities that have taken place, and so on. And we refer to this loosely as the archives complex, because we think the main purpose there was the generation and storage and archiving of documents. I'm not sure that archiving is the right word, but for present purposes, you'll understand that the context there is largely about the generation and storage of texts, rather than about the storage of commodities and the disbursement as it is elsewhere at Pylos. Now, when we write a document, we obviously interact with the text or the surface onto which that writing, or into which that writing is placed, and there will be different properties of that surface which will provide a certain different types of resistance to it. But a writing which might take place in a single moment, and is certainly a material practice, implies a reading which is visual, because although we do read things in Braille if we're blind, but essentially reading is a visual exercise. It can take place at multiple times, it can be displaced in time, it can take place days, it can take place millennia. With decipherment, it can take place across language barriers and so on. And of course, it may be displaced in space as well. Text can move as well. But it does imply a reading, and sometimes even that reading is not by humans. It may be designed to be read by gods, in the case of curse tablets, for example, or inscriptions inside Egyptian tombs. The development of writing has been very much bound up with the idea that writing emerged from pictures. It's somehow a sort of systematization, a conventionalization of the language of pictures into a restricted range of signs which have this particular conventional set of meanings. And it was Ignace Gelp in the middle of the 20th century who really fossilized, I suppose, this evolutionary view of writing from pictures to logographic writing, first of all, word writing, to syllabic writing, to the alphabet, which he saw as the pinnacle of all writing forms. And he even denied that Mesoamerican writing, which many people can now read with great facility. He even denied that that was even a writing system because it was so seemingly pictographic. Now, a couple of just two rather complex diagrams to try and sort of elaborate on that notion of the document as having multiple properties. In the case of a document, as I've said, it will be produced, it will be used, it will be deposited. It has a life cycle like any other artifact. And it's a requirement, as I said, for the preservation of an ancient text. It has written materials, and of course it can then be appreciated visually, and it may well be mobile. It bears a text, however, which can be realized orally, or orally if you're listening to someone recite it. And that text may refer at the bottom to the time of creation, some time in the past, true or fictitious, or some time in the future, which will by definition not have existed. It'll be potential, or it too might be fictitious. And I want to just set up a parallel diagram for an image, because one of the things I want to talk about is the way in which images and texts interact over the second millennium. I'll come back to that a little bit later on. But images in some ways share properties with documents. They may generate a text. That text may well be oral rather than written, because the text is not necessarily on the image. And in the case of the Aegean, as I'll argue, you never have text on images. But the image bears the image bears an image. Sorry, that's a bit redundant, I realise. And similarly, that image may itself be related to narratives that are about the past, the present, or about the future. So there are overlaps, if you like, rather in the way that Gelp was thinking about the history of writing, that there are some overlaps in the way those two genres, if you like, or expressive genres work. So in my line of work, you have to do a lot of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, SWOT analysis. So we're going to do a little bit of SWOT analysis of Aegean texts. And we'll just remind ourselves, first of all, that they're not historical, legal, liturgical, literary, epistolary, or any of the things that we find elsewhere in Mesopotamia, for example, or of course in later texts in the Greco-Roman world. They're not in any real sense, unlike the picture, windows on the Aegean world. They're temporally disjunct and they're spatially limited. And we can see that quite easily by putting a graph together which shows the dates and find spots of Linear B. The main sources still are Knossos and Pylos, lots of others as well, and you'll see that they're distributed across a period from perhaps about 1400 down to a little bit after maybe 1200, and distributed in space, as is a bit clearer in this particular map, between Iolkos, Volos in the north, and Knossos, Chania in Crete, and Athens sadly has none, but is there just for reference. And these are just the finds of administrative clay documents, not including the only other category, which are the inscribed stirrup jars, which have a different distribution. They still map onto some of the major centres, but they seem to escape from some of those centres to be deposited elsewhere. And that's something that might bear thinking about. Thinking about how much of the actual stuff we have, and just going back to that point that the objects have to survive from the ancient world for us to be able to study them and read them. If we look at Linear A, we can think of it as probably comprising quite a large amount of documents, many of them written on parchment, as preserved on the flat-based nodules that you see there on the left-hand side of the slide, which simply are not preserved by definition. They were burnt away by the very fires that preserved the clay that formed the ceiling around those documents. And in fact, clay documents, like what you see in the bottom right, are relatively scarce. Even Naya Triada, with its largest group, about 150 clay documents, it can't match up to any of the larger deposits in Linear B. Now, that may or may not be an accident, or it may be a real pattern, but just for the sake of argument, I'm arguing that. And then the visible objects, other than clay, Linear A is written on quite a large number of objects in stone, in metal, and ceramics, etc. So the pattern of preservation is that we seem to have lost an awful lot of what was written in Linear A, and what survives, obviously, is skewed heavily towards materials that are survived or perhaps are valuable. In the case of Linear B, not quite the inverse, but I think, at any rate, that clay is the predominant medium for Linear B documents. We can dispute that in the garden afterwards. And that the number of invisible objects in parchment or papyrus, etc., may in fact be very small, if not non-existent. And then we have a small number of other types of objects, largely the inscribed syrup jars that you see there on the left. But slightly more importantly, we need to think about what opportunities we have for the documents, first of all, to be written, and secondly, to be preserved for us by the moment in which they were burnt and fired in the places where they were found. And the majority of Linear B documents relate to cyclical activities. So they may be yearly activities like the Pylos documents, the MA documents, which deal with rounds of taxation on the entire polity. They may be monthly documents, such as the monthly, and they're actually dated often with the month, offerings to deities from Knossos and also from Pylos. And if you like, those documents are preserved by administrative practice, by a sort of administrative taphonomy that preserves them for us or not. And there is a third type of document, which I've outlined in yellow there, which I'm calling contingent. And these are documents which are written when unexpectedly a change of state occurs and something needs to be written down. By definition, we will not tend to capture those when we apply our actual archaeological taphonomic process. In other words, the documents that are current at the moment at which the burning takes place in the place where they're preserved, where they happen to come to be preserved. We will capture very few, if you like, of the contingent documents, because by definition they're written and probably disposed of very quickly, whereas we will tend to capture more of the cyclical documents. And I think this is one of the reasons why Finlay's initial arguments about the totality of control in the Mycenaean palaces was actually so prevalent for many years, because the administrative skew towards the documents was to things that seemed to be regular and in many cases political, if you like, throughout the entire polity. This is one of these contingent documents. I won't dwell on it very long, but it documents a payment probably for alum, structuria. There's two of them. And the reason we think it's contingent is particularly clear in the one on the top, because the text at the top has nothing to do with the text at the bottom. The document was originally written the opposite way. It was erased. The lines that went, as it were, vertically on the text as we see it were erased. It was rewritten. It was chopped at the bottom, rewritten with one text. A line was left blank and another text was added for this particular transaction, a payment of these commodities: wool, goats, wine and figs, presumably to the person Attalos who was delivering this commodity. The one at the bottom is similar, and I won't go into great detail about that. So Linear B texts can offer us specific types of information about individual actions. They can offer us insights into structure, vertical structure about social hierarchy, for example, and horizontal structure, as in political geography of the Mycenaean polities, particularly Pylos and Knossos. And they can also offer us qualitative and quantitative information about commodities, such as textiles, oil, also animals. What they can't offer us is a diachronic perspective, because by definition they're essentially synchronic, preserved in that one moment of destruction, and they therefore need to be linked to archaeological data. To go back to the point I made at the beginning, they are themselves material objects. They cannot provide a contemporary view, i.e. we can't look at Knossos from Pylos, we can't look at Pylos from Knossos because the documents don't even match, nor do they offer a total or panoptic view. The more we learn about them, the more selective they appear, and the more they seem to be written from a particular point of view, a central and a top-down point of view. And if we pick just one example, one way of thinking about that, if we take this sequence of production, distribution, and consumption, and compare archaeological preservation in blue with the way it appears in the text, the Linear B text at any rate, in the case of production, it's actually quite difficult to document the actual moment of production archaeologically. How do you document the moment of production of bronze, for example? Is it where the tin tin ore is removed and then smelted, or the copper ore, or where they're alloyed, or where they're actually made into objects when they've been alloyed, and so on? Similarly, distribution, we tend to find that objects in distribution in very rare archaeological contexts, such as wrecks. Uluburun, of course, springs to mind. And most objects that we recover archaeologically turn up in consumption context, after use, after discard, even if that discard is deliberate, deposition in a shrine, for example. In the case of Linear B documents, it's almost the opposite. Most documents refer to production, the procurement of commodities and the production, the management of production before their circulation within and beyond Mycenaean polities. There's minimal information about distribution. It's not entirely absent, but it's minimal. And there's a little bit of information about consumption, but by definition, it's rare. It's usually in storage, use, or prior to consumption, where animals, for example, are being contributed to festivals and so on. So when production is mentioned, though, it's actually mentioned in three distinct ways in the document. So it's not that we get a single consistent picture. It's either direct, where someone is documenting the elements or the stages or the movement of material, explicitly recorded, for example, in the Knossos woolen industry or the Pylos bronze industry, or it's indirect, i.e. occupational names are mentioned, but in other contexts, sometimes receiving rations and so on, or it's implicit in the products that are referred to. So we know that certain cloth was produced. We don't know how, but we know it was. And similarly, we know of commodities like kouanos, blue glass, or elephas ivory, which appear. And if we look at that in terms of a sort of chaîne of production from, in the case of bronze, the extraction of copper and tin, the shipping of those, the alloying, the manufacture, etc., and I wouldn't defend any single detail of this diagram. It's merely meant to suggest the situation. But if we look at where the documents come in, it's in that point. The Pylos bronze documents deal with 576 kilograms of bronze, which is allocated to about 300 smiths, which will immediately tell you not a lot of bronze to each one, at 17 different locations. And it's clearly bronze. It's not copper that's going to be alloyed. It's bronze that's being, I think, recycled. And we don't know what happens to it after it's assigned to those particular smiths. Similarly, in the Knossos woolen textiles, you have lots and lots of sheep in Crete and elsewhere, which go through an annual cycle. That's what the circles are supposed to suggest. And they are sheared annually, and so on. That wool is used by the palace at Knossos. We know this thanks to the work largely of John Killen and Marie-Louise Noche and so on. And we know that there are about 80 to 100,000 sheep at over 30 locations, perhaps 900 female weavers who are involved at 15 locations, maybe to produce about 700 pieces of cloth annually. So the interest in the palace there in recording is about essentially the sheep as producer of wool and what happens to the wool afterwards and its transformation into cloth. Archaeologically, we find those sheep only after consumption, as dead stock, as they're called, and we have very few references in the text to that. We have some references in banqueting texts to contributions of animals and so on. And just to try and bring that home, what through the work of Paul Halstead and others we can see is that, in fact, the picture we have of a Knossian single woolen industry, which took charge of a large number of sheep from birth to fleece, as it were, in fact is rather misleading, because what we have are a series of flocks that the palace declares an interest in and says that it wants to be kept up to a certain size. Another set of flocks in yellow that are actually attributed to other participants in the process who are called collectors. No time to go into that, I'm afraid. And then the palatial wool goes to palatial workshops on the right. The collector wool goes to collector workshops on the right. But beneath all of it are the unfilled squares, the ones that don't enter into, that we don't see in the palatial records. And the reason we know they're there is because the flocks that are of interest to the palace and to the collectors are actually made up every year by stock coming in from outside, from these other flocks. So in fact, what we're seeing is only a selection of quite a large industry, and there's a lot going on underneath or alongside that. And One suspects that this is true of many other aspects. It's just that because of the extraordinary documentation we have at Knossos, that we can actually document this going on. So texts are material objects fixed in time and space. They contain this intangible content which is attached to a medium or substrate, as it's sometimes called, but potentially references other times, spaces, and or even other realities. And they tend to be used by us as sources of information from the past that appear to speak to us directly, an etic view, as I suggested. What we might want to do is to understand better how the texts are used by them, as it were, the people we're studying, as part of a broader set of cultural practices which are effective within those past societies, an emic view, if you like. How does the writing of one of these documents actually ensure the delivery of cloth? How does it actually ensure the delivery of tax? The document itself obviously doesn't do that. The writing of the document itself doesn't do that. There must be ways in which that's embedded culturally in order to achieve those particular ends. And what I'd like to argue in the last few minutes is that what we'd have to do is to take quite a long historical perspective on the relationship between writing, image, things, and place, which I'm going to argue is an interactive relationship that emerges over the second millennium and is clearest in the latest period when we have Linear B documents that we can read and understand at places like Pylos. So when writing was first adopted in the Aegean, I should say invented really, just before 2000 BC it seems or so, image and text occupied the same field. Not only that, but it was actually possible to make a text simply by impressing a seal stone into clay. It didn't require, if you like, the knowledge of how to write and the application of a stylus to that clay or to any other medium. So it was actually possible to do that without knowing how to write, if you like. And that tradition of stamping seals continues throughout. On the left, you see an example in the Ashmolean Museum of two hieroglyphic seals which have text on them, which have been impressed on clay, so a text made by stamping. And on the right, at the very opposite end, if you like, of the millennium, the two sides, or actually three sides, the bottom one is actually two facets, of a small ceiling that was made at Knossos. Well, who knows the date, but let's say 1350 BC. And I've distinguished there between the solid yellow, which is another seal impression, but at this time only a representational seal impression, and the hollow yellow arrows which show where text has been applied. In the upper image, it's the ideogram for wool, and in the bottom image it says nekiri de. We don't know what that really means, but it occurs on another document. It's clearly a group of people. So what this is presumably an object that was attached to a delivery of wool, maybe from these particular people. It was retained as a recording of that particular transaction, but it came in with those particular things. By the time you get to the Neopalatial period, the middle, if you like, of the second millennium, that juxtaposition in the same field of image and text has disappeared, and we get the rather odd, if you like, situation where we have golden seal rings which have images on them, or they have, very rarely, text on them, like the Mavrospelio ring you see at the bottom right there. But never, or almost never, certainly not continuous text in the same field. And that's a bit strange because on Linear B documents and also in Linear A documents, for example HT31, which I haven't got time to show, there is this ability to apply text, which is in blue on these slides, to give precision to an image, an ideogram as we call it, or logogram perhaps more properly, which is ringed in orange. The top document is a chariot tablet from the Arsenal deposit at Knossos. On the left, in blue, is the phrase iquia, horsey feminine thing, chariot, and the top right is in orange is the chariot itself. The one on the right, on the left, you have kararewe, clarewes, the name for stirrup jars, and an ideogram of stirrup jars in orange. And at the bottom, a bit simpler, parwea, farwea at the bottom left, and an ideogram of cloth in the middle. But there are other instances where, if you like, we have a sort of what we might think of as a hybrid syntax, a syntax that depends not just on the fact that text sits on objects, as I was saying at the very beginning, but the fact that text applied to objects, if you like, created a narrative or a comment about those documents, about those objects. So many stone libation tables have no text on them. Some of them have text on them. And presumably that text relates to situating the object within some form of narrative, perhaps describing who the donor is, who the dedicatee is, maybe even the place of dedication. It's in linear A, so we can't read it, understand it at least. Or on the left, an inscribed stirrup jar which has the name Winayo, interestingly occurs on other stirrup jars, not least one at Armeni, which may describe ownership or ownership of the workshop and so on. But it embeds that object within an administrative context, if you like. And bear in mind that these were made before firing, so they're fired onto the vessel. So someone knew before the object was actually made and completed that this had to be on it. And we can also think of a sort of triple syntax, object, image, and text, on some of the ceilings that are used in the latest Mycenaean period. These examples are from Thebes, where we have a text which is combined with a seal impression. Presumably the image on the seal impression notates a person or an office, but they come along with an object which accompanies them. So the impression is accompanied by an object, in this case a pig, which is coming from Amarinthos, and it seems to have been finished, i.e. fattened up for sacrifice by a man called Kerios, Berios or something like that, and so on. But the actual text is not even required. You can actually make that sentence, if you like, by simply attaching a seal impression to clay and attaching that without sealing the object that comes in. So the two together become, if you like, an instance of an interactive instance where text is generated. And I've argued, and like to argue again, that the same sorts of things are happening in relation to both large scale, that's life size, or near life size representations in spaces, as in this illustration by Clary Palivou from Thera, where, as she describes it, the two life-size fisher boys almost seem like they're coming out of the wall to participate with you as you occupy the room. And the second type, which involves seeing the whole picture, and I would argue always a narrative, which I'm describing as panoptic. And what strikes me about those particular representations is that there are no captions. There's no text which keys you in to the story of what's going on, as happens elsewhere at other times and places. And a special type of that particular, if you like, participatory or interactive creation of an artistic scene happens in scenes of framing, particularly in the throne room at Knossos, as you see here, and its almost twin at Pylos, perhaps some 200 years later, where by someone placing their physical presence on the throne in the middle, they automatically participate as if in relief, as if in 2.5 dimensions, with the griffins on either side. And that is both iconic, because those griffins represent griffins. See what I mean about fictitious things that can be represented in text and image? Or they're symbolic, because griffins partake of raptors and lions and so on, so they participate of a powerful world. But they're also indexical, because we know from other representations that griffins are supposed to be large. So by placing the person in this frame, they also are enlarged by their association with the representation of the griffins. And that happens, as I said, at Pylos too, where the person inserts themselves within the plane of the image that's shown flattened on the right, seated figure who looks out into the main megaron, and of course he's viewed as a 2.5, and I do say he, viewed as a 2.5 dimensional image from the people elsewhere in the room. So in the case of Pylos, we have both participatory interactions, the performance of the Wanax by situating himself in the throne, requiring his co-presence in the scene, and similarly processional scenes which invite people to process along parallel to the plane of the image. and also panoptic representations in Hall 64, which we've argued, Jack Davis and myself and others have argued, were mediated by oral performance, as signified by the lyre player represented in the main Megaron, that enlivened the scenes, gave specificity to those particular scenes. So if we take a sort of history of writing and image throughout the second millennium, early Aegean writing combined image and text, and the text could potentially be impressed in one go as a seal. Then that led to a polar opposition between image and text by the Neopalatial Late Bronze Age and beyond. And a result of that was that writing was only carried out in the moment, with the writer present. Again, that idea of co-presence. And it just hints at the possibility that writing was actually, could only, if I could do it, could only exist when speech was also present. But the overall implication is that writing is only a small part of a much wider cultural literacy among the Aegean elite, a visual literacy, a literacy of etiquette, if you like, a court decorum, as Baines and Yoffe have described it in another context. And of course, this may well continue in an oral context through the river of song, the continuity of practice and tradition that we pick up at the end of the period in the time of Homer, transmitted through oral tradition to, let's say, the 8th century, but I know the date of Homer is much disputed. So in this context, if we're trying to think about who the texts are for, I'd argue that we need to understand properly the ancient social context across the board, texts and all sorts of other cultural practices. And by examining that and reflecting on that and analysing that, that generates a kind of insight rather than simply the plundering of those texts simply for information that we assemble ourselves. And that is as close as I can get on a rather warm early June afternoon to an emic view of what we're talking about. And just a final thought about why might this matter? Well, I'd argue that the role and nature of writing here is potentially different or other than what's familiar to us in the modern Western world, and also, I'd say, in other ancient situations as well. But it also offers a possibility of a history of the period that involves the lives of the people at the time, and through a combination of a narrative that is more than simply a meta-history, an extraction of text and an assembly in the way that we think appropriate. And so, ideally, a richer, more challenging interpretation of the Aegean Late Bronze Age, but of that, you can be the judges. So, ευχαριστώ για την προσοχή σας.